We are our own demons, and we make this world our hell. Oscar Wilde. The house of one's own shadow. The forest tightened around the road like the drawstrings of a sack. The farther he went, the closer the fir trees leaned in, their branches scraping at the air. The horse snorted, exhaling white clouds of steam, each puff rising like a ghost, unwilling to linger in this world. The wagon wheels creaked plaintively, and the sound echoed through the trunks, as if somewhere deep beneath the roots, old bones were waking and turning over. Scents pressed into his chest, thick and heavy, wet pine needles, rotting leaves, clay black as dried blood, and a thin metallic note, as if the air itself had just been licked by rust. The night wasn't darkness, it was an animal's hide, warm, breathing, with a sparse silver fur of moonlight. Those thin blades of light sliced the dark into strips, then slipped away, leaving everything without form. He held the reins, but the leather felt alive, tightening and loosening beneath his fingers, pulsing faintly. He thought that if he let go, the horse would drop to its knees and weep like a human. He said nothing, saving his breath. The air was thick as honey, and any word seemed bound to stick to his tongue and rot right there in his mouth. The road curved, and the forest, as if hearing a whisper meant only for him, fell even more silent. Even the snow, a faint dusting along the edges of the path, stopped crunching when the wheels cut through it. And into that stillness it appeared, the figure on the road. At first, just a fold in the dark, then a line of shoulders, too straight, as if drawn with a ruler on a blueprint. Then a face. It didn't shine, but neither did it swallow light like everything else. It held it, as wax does. The smile was correct, practiced, but too wide, as though someone had tried to show they knew where human lips belonged and had overdone it. The horse shuddered as if brushed by a cold, wet broom, and froze. The wagon lurched, and beneath his feet the boards gave a short crunch, a sound that sent ants carrying needles up his spine. "Tough road," she said. The voice didn't come from her mouth. It came from everywhere at once, from the moss, from his own teeth, from the hollow hearts of pine cones lying by the roadside, and from inside his head, like a thought that had been waiting too long to be born, and finally tore free. He didn't answer. His tongue was heavy and smooth, like a wet river stone. "Where are you going?" she asked and stepped forward. The movement didn't reveal her legs. The darkness was reluctant to release her, but it hinted they existed. A scent stirred the air, not feminine, not forest, a clean medicinal chill like the glass bottles of formalin. "Home," he said at last, and the word came out like a splinter, with a crack, leaving a thin, bloody line behind. "Home," she echoed, smiling wider. "A good direction. Reliable. Everyone shares the same one." He tried to look away, but his gaze kept returning like a boomerang. Her eyes were not eyes, two dark puddles with a still moon lying in each. If you stared long enough, you could see your own reflection, but it didn't follow your face. It smiled faster. "The road's closed," she said, "but we can talk." Sometimes a conversation is also a way forward. He felt the air in his lungs grow colder than outside, as though someone had quietly scooped out its warmth. The horse trembled. Each shiver ran through the reins as a faint vibration, like a whisper. He inhaled. The forest slipped resinous bitterness under his tongue. "Who are you?" he asked. The question sounded like a coin tossed into a well, falling long without a ring. "The one who brings back," she said simply, "and the one who sends away. There are many names. You'll choose the one that suits you. People like to name the things they fear. I'm not afraid," he said. And just then the horse stumbled. The statement crumbled like dry bread, scattering its fragrant crumbs inside him. She tilted her head like a mirror angling for the light. "Then look," the entity said. The forest obediently pulled apart, like fabric unrolled from a bolt in one smooth motion. From beneath the darkness, something blacker still emerged, a long band stretching ahead. It was still the road, but now it seemed alive, a broad vein running from a heart. The trees along its edges suddenly grew taller, nearer. Their trunk faces leaned in, inhaling, and each breath chimed faintly, as if glass bells hung beneath the bark. The entity stood beside him, and he realized she took up no space, yet there was less of it now. Less air. Words became longer. "You'll return home," she said, "but first, home will return to you." He didn't understand, but had no time to ask. She raised her hand. It was a proper hand, 5 fingers, nails thin as translucent ice scales. Only the length was wrong. The fingers stretched too far, like roots stubbornly reaching for water. When a nail touched his shirt, the fabric gave a quiet, embarrassed sound, like snow under a heel. Shh! The cold he felt ceased to be temperature and became an object, a smooth needle piercing his chest, clean through. The world trembled. It didn't tilt or turn. It quivered like water's surface when a stone breaks it. He saw ripples on the trunks, on the wheels, on the horse's mane, on his own hands. Each ripple was a reflection of something he didn't want to recognize. The horse raised its head, mouth half open, and for the first time he heard air crackling between a living creature's teeth. "Easy," said the entity, and the sound of her voice drew an invisible thread across the night. He inhaled, and the breath stopped, hitting an unseen wall. Then he realized he was no longer breathing air. He was breathing silence. Silence thick and bitter, filling his lungs like smoke from an old, long-dead stove. He tried to cough, but the cough hung in his throat like a curtain fallen from its hook. The forest took another breath and turned inside out. The trees didn't vanish at once. First, window frames appeared on their bark, long and narrow like scars. Then lights went out in those windows, leaving only empty rectangles. The firs stretched like candles and melted away, leaving behind faint tendrils of soot, soot that turned at once into black cracks along the walls. The vein beneath the wheels stopped pulsing. Cobblestones grated instead. The horse threw its leg forward. The horseshoe struck stone, and the sound was so familiar his knees buckled. He was standing. When he had jumped down, he couldn't recall, and staring. Before him lay a city, his city, but it was burned black like bread forgotten in the oven. Houses stood without roofs, like heads without scalps. Windows were hollow sockets. Cracks crawled along the walls, resembling long, patient sentences about how everything ends. Wind came through the doorways, carrying the smell of childhood, burnt semolina, warm iron radiators, cold water from a zinc bucket. And beneath it, that ache, that simple blind ache toward an adult world that never explained that everything would one day burn. "Home," the entity said softly, almost tenderly. "There it is." The city wasn't dead. It breathed. Not like the forest, differently. It breathed through fissures, through collapsed ceilings, through empty entrances. On the inhale, ash rose in light gray flocks. On the exhale, it settled on windowsills and steps, slow and steady, like dust on a corpse's shoulders. Somewhere far away, iron groaned, a sound that made him clutch his chest. He knew that sound, the old kitchen window that never shut unless you nudged it with your knee. "This," he began, but the word that should have been impossible died before it was born. The entity stood beside him. Her presence explained too much for him to want to ask. She wasn't looking at the city. She was looking at him, attentively but without curiosity, the way a craftsman looks at something they themselves have made. "You've been traveling a long time," she said. "Roads always lead here, even when people turn away. You turned, didn't you? There," she nodded toward the street where the old bread line used to form. "And there, farther, where the school stood with paint forever peeling off its railings. But turning isn't the same as leaving." He stayed silent. Words inside him opened their mouths like fish in a drained pond, gulping emptiness. A taste melted on his tongue, sweet and terrifying, like the rubber nipples of baby bottles boiled too long until the rubber turned bitter. The horse behind him shuddered. He looked back. The wagon still stood on the same cobblestones, but its wheels had sunk slightly, as if the stones had softened. The horse's eyes were white moons, each reflecting the ruined street, and those twin streets entered his mind one after another, cold as fog. "Come," said the entity, and for the first time her we sounded easy, almost innocent. "The real talk is closer." "Where?" "There," he asked. His voice echoed off the walls with a dry clatter, like a fallen key. "There." "Where you haven't looked yet," she answered, and stepped forward. For a moment he saw her shadow spread over the stones, deeper than the night itself, like the mark of a torn-out nail on dead flesh. He followed. The city stirred like a wound beneath a bandage. Somewhere, a pipe moaned, a cornice collapsed, lifting a puff of dust. There had been no wind between the houses. Now it started, cautiously, as if testing whether something would crack if it blew harder. The snow, that white punctuation along the forest road, was gone, as if it had never existed. Instead, from every crack and broken tile came warmth. Familiar and useless, like an old sweater that still smells of someone who once loved you. "Home," he whispered, and the word warmed his lips. "Home," she agreed. "First, look. Then, speak." He looked, at the street that remembered his footsteps, at the windows that had once mirrored his running, his laughter, at the porch under which he had hidden his treasures, smooth stones, rusty washers, twigs shaped like swords. Now all those places looked back at him, without reproach, without pity. Just looked. The entity raised her hand, not to touch, but to point. The air before them clenched like a wet sheet in a fist, and in its fold appeared a familiar outline. A doorway. Their door. Heavy with a slanted crack at the bottom that had always breathed dust and cool air. "Let's go," she said. He nodded. His legs found the old shallow dip he used to step over to avoid tripping. His body remembered what his mind still argued wasn't real. His palm touched the rough wood. The splinters under his fingers quivered like tiny muscles. He pushed. The door opened inward, releasing first a sterile cold, like a hospital, and then the smell. Warm bread, gooseberry jam, toasted semolina, old books half blended with dust. and something else that smelled like the night he turned 7, when he feared the dark so much he couldn't breathe. He stepped into the hallway. Behind him on the threshold stood the entity. Her smile was smaller now, but more precise, perfectly fitted to the frame of the door. She didn't enter. She stood where the foreign ends and the familiar begins. "Now, look," she said, her voice smooth as a thread sewing on a button. "And remember." He realized the conversation had begun back on the road, and here would begin the reason the road existed at all. The hallway greeted him with a ringing sound. Not a real one, but that inner ringing the ears hear in complete silence. The sound grew as if the old walls had caught his footsteps and began to multiply them, turning each careful click of his heel into a whole choir. The floorboards trembled beneath his feet, as though the ground itself was breathing under them. Old coats hung from nails, but they didn't smell of fabric. They reeked of a damp cellar, as if every thread had soaked in black water. He stepped further in, and the air changed. As a child, he'd never paid attention to the scent of the house, but now the smells hit his nose sharply, painfully. Burnt milk, wooden toys, dusty textbooks, starch on fresh sheets. Everything mixed together, and his heart quivered like a rotten tooth. The entity remained in the doorway. Its silhouette didn't move, but he knew. It was watching every breath he took. "Go," it whispered. He entered the living room. The room looked as if it had been pulled out of memory, but rewritten by a stranger's hand. The dishes on the table didn't gleam. They gave off a dull glow like gravestones under moonlight. The armchair in the corner breathed. The fabric on the armrests rose and fell, as though someone sat there, invisible and heavy, and only their breathing betrayed their presence. And then he saw them. At first, faint silhouettes by the window. Then, figures, as if carved out of smoke. They began to take shape, shoulders, hands, faces. He clamped a hand over his mouth not to scream. It was them, his kin, neighbors. Those who had once laughed with him, laid a hand on his head, shared their bread. But their faces were now distorted. Eyes had slipped downward, lips had blurred into pale stains, and the skin hung in folds, as if it had been stretched and released. They were still recognizable, and that was the most terrifying part. They stared at him with hollow sockets and opened their mouths. No words came out, only a hissing sound like rain on a roof. But the hissing formed his name. He heard it again and again, and each repetition carved a new crack in his chest. "You remember them," the entity whispered. Its voice wasn't loud, yet it drowned out all the hissing. "You remember their faces alive, but they remember you." As you were, one of the figures moved forward. A woman with ruined features, yet in the tilt of her neck, in the familiar gesture of pressing her hands to her chest, he recognized his mother. He wanted to rush toward her, but his feet were rooted to the floor, as if the boards had wrapped wooden fingers around his ankles. She reached out to him, bony, transparent hands woven from cobwebs, and the hissing that clung to his name grew louder, more insistent, almost tender. The entity, still standing in the doorway, smiled. "They're waiting, but not to embrace you. They're waiting to show you what you've forgotten." The room swayed. The walls began to crawl upward, the ceiling dissolved, and suddenly he saw that beyond the windows there was no street. Only endless emptiness filled with faces. Faces, faces, faces. They stretched upward and downward, an infinite river, all calling his name. Some reached out their hands, some laughed, others wept. And then he understood. These were not just the dead. These were his dead, the ones he had left behind, betrayed, failed to save. Every step he had ever taken had led to another face in that endless crowd. Cold ran over his skin like a swarm of insects, and he heard his own breathing, loud, ragged, foreign. The entity finally entered the room. It didn't walk, it glided, and wherever its shadow touched the floorboards, the wood turned black, as if burning without flame. It leaned close to him and whispered, "This is only the beginning of the procession. From here they will lead you on." And the figures nearest to him began to move, slowly, heavily, like slabs being pushed from their tombs. They closed in around him, and the air thickened, sticky and suffocating. Each breath he took felt as if it passed through hundreds of alien mouths. He wanted to run, but the path had already folded in around him. The procession had begun. He stood among the shadows, and they pressed in on him like a crowd, only cold. Their touches were weightless, yet each shadow left a trace, as if thin lines of frost were rising on his skin. They didn't shove him or tear him apart. They simply moved, and he had to move with them. It felt as though they knew the way better than he did, and he was only a passenger inside his own body. The entity glided beside him. Her presence sat in his chest like a stone, heavy, inevitable. She didn't look at him as at a person. She looked at him like a book whose pages had been read and reread 100 times. "You see," she said, and her words didn't need air. They settled in his head at once, like ash. "But you don't understand yet." "What is this place?" he forced out, his voice rasping, as if someone else's lungs were speaking. "This isn't a place," she answered gently. "It's your road. You've walked it all your life. Every step. To hear he wanted to argue, to say he'd lived as he lived, that no one deserves an end like this. But at that moment the shadow's whisper merged into a single drone, and he heard, not their words, but his own. His own, once thrown at other people, indifferent, cruel, fleeting, yet sharp as nails. They drove into his ears, and he recognized himself in all those voices. The entity smiled. "Shall I remind you of more?" She raised her hand, and the space before him rippled like murky water. From the haze a scene surfaced, himself, young, turning away from a friend who had asked for help. The vision dissolved. Next, his mother crying in the kitchen while he pretended not to hear. A third, a woman holding his hand, and he let go and walked away because it was easier. The images crashed over him one after another, each slicing his heart with a knife carved from his own bones. "You built this road yourself," the entity said, "stone by stone, word by word, act by act. You thought you were heading home, but each time you turned toward what was convenient. And here is your home." He shut his eyes, but the scenes kept burning under his lids, as if they'd been branded inside him. "That's a lie," he whispered, but the words rang hollow. The entity inclined her head. "A lie? Do you know what a lie smells like?" She inhaled, and the room filled with the stench of burnt meat. "That is the smell of a lie. Now breathe deeper and tell me this isn't yours." He breathed in, and his lungs seared. Dust stirred in his throat, thick as ash. He coughed, and with the cough, a name tore free. His own name. The shadows answered with a hum, as if 1,000 throats spoke that name at once. The drone shook the walls, vibrated in his bones, and he felt it. The procession of memory, the procession of guilt. The entity leaned closer. Her breath was a cold that slid beneath the skin like needles of ice. You thought the forest detained you. The forest only showed you the crack. Now you're inside. There is no exit here, but there is truth. He raised his head and his eyes met hers. There were no pupils in those eyes, only two mirrors. In them he saw himself, not as he had been, but as he had never wanted to admit he was. Tears rose, salty only by half. The other half was bitter, like metal. "What will you do to me?" he asked. She smiled as if the question were a child's riddle. "I do nothing. I only open. The rest, you do yourself." At that moment, the walls shivered. The room stretched, turning into a long corridor, and on both sides stood everyone, faces known and forgotten. They looked at him, and every look was a question. "Why you? Why did you do that?" He stepped back, but the entity was there. "Forward," she said, and there was no threat in her voice, only inevitability. "Now you go where the road becomes you." And he understood. Ahead lay not an ending, but a dismantling of himself, layer by layer, down to the root. He walked down the corridor, and with each step the air grew heavier, as though a vault were hanging above him, not built of stone, but of his own thoughts. The walls trembled as if a heart were beating inside them. The shadows said nothing, yet he knew. They were waiting. The entity did not hurry. She moved beside him, and her silence spoke louder than words. Suddenly, the space around him turned transparent. Not with images. No, it was thinner than that, as if the air itself had decided to become a mirror. He saw not scenes from his past, but the essence of who he had been. And that was worse than any picture. He saw how his deeds formed a pattern, not isolated actions, but a current. Each step, each word, each glance, everything carried a shade. In some places the pattern was lighter, but its foundation was thick, heavy darkness, like hardened pitch. And he understood. What he had taken for coincidence was a road, not a chain of mistakes, but a direction. The entity leaned closer. Her voice slid over his skin like a thin blade. "You always thought you were choosing, but choice is only where your nature leads you." His heart pounded so hard it filled his ears. He wanted to protest, to say that he'd loved, that he'd cared, that he'd been human. But the air would not allow lies. The words he tried to form crumbled before reaching his mouth. Only silence remained, and it was confession enough. The shadows began to move. They did not attack or grasp at him. They slowly bent toward him, as if examining something unearthed, chipped, cracked, yet still bearing the mark of its maker. And in their eyeless gazes there was no malice, no pity, only knowing. He felt the weight inside him grow, not pressing from without, rising from within, as though a sack full of stones had opened inside his chest, the stones slowly tumbling downward into his gut, his legs, anchoring him to the ground. "This is your weight," said the entity, "not sins, not mistakes, the weight of your path." He staggered. The corridor wavered around him, and he realized his steps no longer carried him forward. The road no longer extended outward. It turned inward. The entity did not smile. Her face was now empty, expressionless. "Everyone returns home," she said, "but home is what you carry inside." The words fell into him like stones. He understood. Not hell, not damnation, not punishment, but a return to what he truly was. And in that moment he felt real fear, because for the first time he saw it clearly. There was no one to judge him. He himself was the judgment. He stood in the middle of the corridor, and the walls began to dissolve. First into gray smoke, then into pure emptiness. The shadows scattered like a flock of birds, but he knew they hadn't gone. They had stayed inside him. Their breath still lingered in every breath he took. Beneath his feet, the road appeared again. Only now it led neither forward nor back. It twisted, coiled, curved, and in every bend he recognized himself. Here were footsteps full of hope. Here, footsteps taken in indifference. Here, the steps where he turned away. And all of them came together into the same circle. He walked, at first cautiously, then faster. But the road always brought him back to where he had already been. With every new circle, the city changed. The houses grew lower, then taller, then disappeared entirely. Only one thing remained the same. The silence, thick, sticky, tar-like. He stopped, stared into the distance. But there was no end there. Only himself, again and again, in endless reflection. The entity no longer walked beside him, yet her presence was in every step. At times he thought her hand almost brushed his shoulder, but whenever he turned, there was only emptiness behind him. Then he understood. She was no longer needed. She had opened the door. The rest was his own road. He closed his eyes and tried to remember how the real forest had looked. The road, the horse, but memory no longer obeyed. All that came were images from this city, the walls, the cracks, the faces that called his name. Everything else was gone, and in that void his own voice spoke. Not from his mouth, from everywhere at once, the way the entity once had. "You are the road." The words echoed through the emptiness, returning louder each time, until they became an unbearable roar. He covered his ears, but the echo came from within. He fell to his knees. The stones under his hands were cold as ice. He lifted his head, and before him stood his house. Always the same one. The door with the slanted crack. The eternal return. He understood. This wasn't a circle. It was a loop, and he was caught in it forever. The entity was gone, but her smile remained in his memory, carved like a scar. And when he took the next step, the road led him back to the same door. Again and again, and it would always be so.